if you take the knowledge that they had of Natalie's fear of deep, dark water, the fact that she couldn't swim, she's now in that ocean, in the deep, dark water, which just breaks my heart to even talk about. And he looks down there and he sees her in the water and he lets her float away. He murdered her, just as if he took a gun and shot her right there. He murdered her.
I am very excited to again be having the opportunity to speak to Sam Perroni. Sam is a former federal prosecutor and author of the book Brainstorm, an investigation into the mysterious death of Natalie Wood, a very intense private investigation of the Natalie Wood case. I highly recommend that you read this book if you haven't. I think the more we talk to Sam, the more you'll understand why. So Sam, good to see you again. Thank you so much for joining us again this evening. Pleasure to see you.
It's always a pleasure to see you, Carrie. And I had a good time during our last interview. You asked some great questions, and so I was more than happy to do a repeat.
One thing for the sake of our viewers that Sam has asked me to let people know is that Sam has a hearing disability. So he is actually reading my questions on a closed caption screen.
Let me start back when I was 11. I'm not going to tell you how I used to walk to school in the freezing rain and snow barefooted. While that's true, what I wanted to say was I became taken by Natalie Wood when I was 11 years old. I did see most of her movies as I was growing up. And I just thought not only she was a beautiful woman, there was just something about her. She just had it. Whatever it is and was, she had it. When Natalie Wood died, I was very suspicious. I spent my entire career in the criminal law business. I've seen every kind of motive and twist and turn you can think of, things that you just say, you can't make this stuff up. When it happened and I started hearing reports, it just didn't add up. I mean, it just didn't pass the smell test. But what was I going to do about it? I mean, there I was in Arkansas, and this happened in California. Supposedly the authorities had looked into all of it. That was that. Well, fast forward to about 2014, and I decided to read Finstad's book, Natasha. Anyway, as I read it, you get to the last chapter, and the last chapter, of course, anybody that's read it, deals with facts that she allegedly dug up in connection with Natalie's death. And it ends with a sensational claim that Lana Wood was told by Dennis Davern around 1991, about 10 years after Natalie's death, that he knew when Natalie was in the water.
Yes.
And that so would Robert Wagner. And he was urging Robert Wagner to do something, and Robert Wagner was basically fighting him off, and that was the end of the book. So when I read that, the whole paragraph was kind of peculiar in my opinion. So I just slammed the book shut and just looked at my wife and said, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to investigate Natalie Wood's death. She, rolled her eyes and went, oh no, here we go again. So that's why I started it. Of course, the first thing that I wanted to do was talk to Lana Wood. But, talking to the sister of Natalie Wood, I was like, okay, how am I going to find her? The first thing that a prosecutor would do was start gathering up information on what statements people have made who had firsthand knowledge or close to firsthand knowledge of the facts. Like, for instance, let's take Lana Wood. I suspected that Lana Wood had some conversations with Robert Wagner about what the heck happened out there. I mean, that just sounds reasonable to me, okay? Her mother had already passed away by then. So there really wasn't anyone else except for Davern and Christopher Walken that would have firsthand knowledge where they would talk to someone. But Lana wrote a book. And so I found the book. I got that book. I got Marty Ruley and Dennis DeVern's book. I had Suzanne Finstad's book, the Lambert book, Gavin Lambert. I started reading these books to see if I could get quotations out of them. In reading Gavin's book, for instance, the Lambert's book, for instance, I had read that he was a close friend of Natalie and Robert Wagner's. I thought, oh, a close friend. That means they probably had some conversations about what went on out there. One thing led to another, and someone gave me Lana Wood's phone number and said I could text her, that she was good about responding to text. So I sent her a text, and she responded to me. And I told her what I was doing, and I asked her if I could meet with her in Los Angeles sometime and talk about this. And surprisingly, she said yes. Now, a couple of days before the interview, she sent me a text message saying I was going to have to pay her $500 in advance before I could talk to her. So I paid it. I was asking her general questions about things, and she started telling me things that were not quoted properly in these books. And so then I began to wonder, okay, now how much can I trust these books about what was said or what wasn't said? Then the time came where I was comfortable enough with Lana that I decided I'd start asking her some hard questions. I mean, some questions that could prove embarrassing to people, might prove actually incriminating. And so one day I took a picture of the last paragraph in Finstad's book, or the last two paragraphs, I think, and I texted it to Lana. And I said, Lana, what do you think about this? The response I got back was, it even shocked me. Her response exactly was this: what was written was incorrect, really poorly written, sloppy, and so mixed up. Well, I looked at the text and I saw where I neglected to tell her it was out of Finstad's book. She thought I had written that.
Wow.
Now, she was being awful candid with me to say that my work was sloppy and poorly written and all. And I said, Lana, I didn't write that. I said, Suzanne Finstad did. And then her response back was, well, I never read her book. Now, I pretty much believe that to be true. Just knowing Lana the way she is. But right there is a serious inconsistency. If you look at the quote in the back of Finstad's book, you'll see that not all of it's in quotes. And in my opinion, it's not all in quotes because she has nothing to back it up. If she had something to back it up, maybe she could let all of us see it. If she's got an email from Lana, or if she's got a transcript of a conversation from Lana, or a tape recording, or something of that nature, she ought to show it to everybody, because right now, the last paragraph in her book, which probably helped her sell who knows how many thousands of copies, is false. The person she said it's false. It's not true. So as I indicated, I began to wonder about where this was going to lead me. About 6 months later, I tracked down one of the people that she identified in her chapter by the name of Paul Wentler. For 40 years, everyone believed that the first indication that there was a problem was a radio communication from Robert Wagner to the shore. I think it was to a shore boat, or an attempted radio communication to a shore boat, where he said something like, help, we need help, or something like that. Well, that is completely incorrect. The first contact that Robert Wagner made and this is in my book, was with Paul Wentler. What happened was he was awakened by someone on the pier calling out for help. And so he heard this, and he got up, put his clothes on, and he went out on the pier because he lived in one of these little leftover World War II shacks that they built right down by the water. So he was right by the pier. Now, this guy was a troubleshooter. So he goes out on the pier and he sees Robert Wagner standing there. And he says, "Hey, Mr. Wagner, what's the problem?" And Robert Wagner looks at him and says, "My wife is gone." Let me stop here for a second. In Finstad's book, she quotes Paul Wentler as saying that he was awakened by loud music and then overheard a radio transmission where Robert Wagner was calling from the yacht asking for somebody to help him. I showed this to Paul Wentler, and he had the same reaction that Natalie Wood did. He said, "I don't know where she got that."
Oh.
I told Suzanne Finstad on a telephone call exactly what I'm telling you. Now, I have my conversation with Mr. Wentler on tape. I don't think Suzanne Finstad can produce anything to show that Paul Wentler said what she said he said. Robert Wagner, somehow or other, made his way from the yacht, which was moored all the way out, almost in the last row of the mooring sites, made his way all the way to the pier. He wasn't wet, so Paul Wentler said he certainly didn't swim. How in the world did this man get to this pier? Because he didn't see anybody else around. There wasn't a dinghy or anything, nothing. So that's the second witness that there was a serious misrepresentation of their knowledge of the case that I saw. And it goes on.
And this was really shocking for me to read. As a lifelong Natalie fan and someone who had always been really interested in this case, I was just delighted that somebody was actually really digging into it, that we had such an in-depth account of things. I revered that book for a long time and highly regarded it. And so it was very shocking for me to read some of these things, particularly the things that had to do with the way she represented what DeVerne said, Natalie being in the water, because I feel like that very much changes the scope.
Yes, it's very disappointing. And don't think I wasn't disappointed. I didn't start out with this thing trying to disparage another author or show that another author's book wasn't truthful. I mean, I actually believed what I read in her book was truthful until I started checking it out. I've got other instances here too. We can talk about them if you like, about things in both books. She came out with the updated book just coincidentally right before my book was supposed to be published, and it's got some humdingers in it.
Really?
And it's too bad. I'm going to give her credit for two things. She's a hell of a lot better writer, story writer than I am, that's for sure. Now, that may not be saying a whole lot because I'm Sam Perroni and not John Grisham, but she is a very good writer. That's number one. And number two, I'll give her credit for this. As far as I know, she's the first author who recognized that there was a discrepancy, a time discrepancy, between the time that Natalie disappeared and the time that people on the Splendor made contact with the authorities to let them know that Natalie was missing. That's a very important thing to do, because she actually developed a mini timeline. And I expanded that because that's the next thing that a good investigator does. They create a timeline in an attempt to try to create it down to the minute, if they can, about what happened during significant periods of time. I have a timeline that I've worked on for years. It's 32 pages long, single-spaced entries.
Wow.
In many cases, down to the minute. Once you get that, you've got a picture of what happened.
That's
And
incredible.
you can also see holes or gaps. You can go, oh my gosh, this happened the day before this happened, or this happened the day after this happened. So she wrote about that, and I'll give her credit for that. But the sensational stuff that she has in her first book, the part that makes you go, oh my gosh, is not true.
Outside of the timeline that she established and the gap that she established, which I do think is very crucial to, understanding what happened that night, do you feel that there are any other contributions this book has made?
Let me say this very carefully.
Okay.
Assuming that the quotations are correct of what she told Dennis DeVerne, if you believe Dennis DeVerne, and there's a lot of circumstantial evidence to believe him, what she told Dennis the Friday night before she died, when they stayed together at the Pavilion Hotel, and Natalie was very upset with Wagner over a jealous episode that he engaged in that Friday evening after dinner before they were going to go to bed. And Natalie just said, I'm going to the island. I'm going to stay on the island tonight. And it was agreed that Davern would go with her because it was about 11 o'clock at night. And so they went to the island, and they rented 2 rooms. But Natalie, according to Davern, said, I'm afraid to stay in here by myself. Will you stay here with me? And he did. And they were up a while, and they were talking. And Natalie, according to Davern, said, among other things, how mad she was at his jealousy over her co-stars, and that she was tired of his drunken rages over her co-stars, and that Monday morning she was going to see her lawyer. Now, if you understand Natalie Wood, if you understand how she was brought up, and if you understand how she broke away from her mother and took control of her life, how she went to therapy and all of those things, then you can, when you hear Dennis Davern say that, you can shake your head and go, yep, that's what Natalie Wood would say.
Yeah.
And so I do believe that those things, again, now if she's quoting people correctly, then that is an important contribution to understanding how and why Natalie died.
Yes, I would agree with that. This was the first really in-depth source on the life of Natalie Wood that I ever encountered. She did, I think, give us a framework to understand Natalie and her life. What about in terms of the dynamics of her relationship with Robert Wagner?
Based on the things that I've read and the people that I've talked to, including Lana Wood, I think she did a good job of being able to give us a pretty focused view on the relationship that they had. She went into it in the updated book, but she didn't have in there why they divorced in the first place. And of course, in her updated book, she has the salacious statement, which I believe to be correct, that Natalie caught Robert Wagner with another man when she came home one day, and she just freaked out. Natalie was done. And again, if you understand the kind of person Natalie was, she, in my opinion, and this is why I began to even like her more as I investigated this. Natalie was a very loyal person. And when somebody betrayed her, it was beyond her to not freak out and say, that's it. I'm done. And that's what she did with Robert Wagner. And I think Robert Wagner thought that she was so in love with him that he could just do whatever he wanted and it wouldn't matter.
Getting back to the Finstad book a little bit, when you were researching your book, did you ever have any personal conversations with Miss Finstad or any communication with her?
And I'm glad you asked this question, because anybody watching this video may walk away with the conclusion that it was my intent to, in order to sell books. By the way, I said from the beginning, all my author profits are going to charity in Natalie's memory. So I hope I sell a bazillion books, because that means I'll have a bazillion dollars to give away to charities.
And just so our viewers know, it's a Catalina Island-based charity that you're donating the proceeds to, right?
Right. I started with the Catalina-based charity. Yes, it's called the Catalina Venture School. It's a preschool for children who can't afford to attend preschool, where their parents can't afford to attend it. Send them to preschool. And I made a pledge to their school that it's a good thing for Catalina Island, Avalon.
That's awesome. Yeah.
But back to what I was, for both of these ladies, I attempted to try to work with them. I thought Suzanne Finstad is certainly a better writer than I am, but Suzanne Finstad doesn't know anything about the criminal law. I mean, she said she was a lawyer, and after I started getting some of these, discrepancies, I decided to check up on that. And apparently at one time she was licensed by the Texas Bar Association, but as far as I could tell, she hadn't been licensed for years. So if that was it, if her career in the law was just working on the probate case for Howard Hughes, for the law firm that she was working at, then she has no experience in the criminal law. And so I thought, okay, I'll contact her and I'll tell her, hey, here are some of the things that I think we can do to dig up some evidence. Here are some of the issues. This does not look right to me. Even Finstad in her first book, even with the quotation from Atlanta, she concluded in her first book it was an accident, because Rasher convinced her it was an accident. He was the chief detective. So I reached out to her through her publishing company and never heard a word from her. Ruley was the same way. I sent her an email and I specifically offered to work with her. And she basically told me to get lost, that she knew everything there was to know about Natalie Wood's death, and that there wasn't much I could do for her.
And for our viewers' sake who maybe haven't read Brainstorm, you actually include the transcript of that email transaction in the book. And I thought that was, yes, it's an amusing part of the book, I thought.
Yes. Well, I included it because, again, I wanted people to know that I didn't strike out on a quest to try to upstage anybody or steal somebody's story or something of that nature. I really started out with the idea of trying to get to the truth. That was it. That was all I wanted to do. I just wanted to get to the truth. I wanted to find out what happened to Natalie Wood and why. And the why is the most important thing, in my opinion. Why? Why would Robert Wagner want his wife, Natalie Wood, dead? That has to be answered before anybody can conclude that Robert Wagner had something to do with her death. You follow? Not accidental negligence or something of that nature, but it had something to do with it, was the proximate cause of it. I thought people might like to see how I was received in the very beginning of all this. I just think they didn't want me poking around in their story. And I use
Yeah.
there in quotes.
Yes, yes. Well, that's definitely when you describe your interactions with Marty Worley, for example. I mean, that is definitely, I think, the impression that the reader walks away with, that this was sort of a territorial thing, a turf thing. So you mentioned that Suzanne Finstad's reissue of Natasha, which included some updated chapters and was called Natalie Wood, The Complete Biography. You feel that the timing of when this was reissued was an attempt to sort of beat your book to the punch.
She knew that I was getting close to getting this book published, and so she decided to update her book. And as far as I can tell, I don't know that she changed anything except for the last part of her book where she talks about Natalie Wood's death. And now, all of a sudden, 21 years later, armed with what she says are salacious new facts and details, she changes her mind from it being an accident to it being a homicide.
Interesting.
Now, just so your viewers understand this, the term homicide includes any death by the hands of another. If you run a red light and run over someone, you've committed a homicide if you were negligent in doing so. It's called negligent homicide. If you kill someone in a heat of passion in the moment, you've committed a homicide. It may not be murder, but you've committed a homicide. So when you say somebody committed a homicide, basically what you're saying is someone else killed them. So it's a significant term to use when authorities and officials are using that term. And so in her updated book, she claims, number one, she claims that the first responder, the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department first responder, a fellow by the name of R.W. Kroll, K-R-O-L-L. He was a deputy, and he was stationed in Avalon. They have a sheriff's department office there. When this all hit the fan, so to speak, he was the first sheriff's representative on the scene. This man wrote a report. It's 10 pages long. And until you get to the part where he talks about to the occupants on the boat about what happened, it is a very detailed and comprehensive report. As far as I know, I am the only person in this world that has a copy of it, a complete copy of it, other than the Los Angeles County Police Department.
That's incredible.
10 pages, right here.
Oh my goodness,
Okay.
That is incredible.
So in her updated book, she claimed that she was permitted. She doesn't say who, but I think she is suggesting that Detective Rasher made arrangements for her to see the complete file on Natalie Wood's death in 2000 before she wrote her first book. She quotes having the file of the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. That's where I come in. Under California law, the Sheriff's Department cannot be selective in its disclosures. It can't disclose to reporter number one because they like reporter number one, and reporter number one writes a lot of nice things about him. They can't disclose something that's confidential and not subject to disclosure and not have to disclose it to all the other reporters.
That makes sense.
Okay. So when I read that she was shown that file, of course, the first thing I did was jump on the Sheriff's Department. Of course, they weren't very happy about dealing with me, and so I had to sue them multiple times to get things. But Miss Finstad, she said, was given a box or two boxes of the file on Natalie Wood's case and a little room at the Sheriff's Department where she could look them over. And she had her mother with her. Now, one of the things she says in this updated book is that Detective Kroll told his wife, who she tracked down, because unfortunately Deputy Kroll passed away in, I think it was 1985 or 86. He drowned off of Catalina Island, free diving. And so she says she tracked down his widow, and that Detective Kroll said he was troubled by the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department closing Natalie's case in '81 as an accident. Well, I tried to find Mrs. Kroll before I even read her book. I spent years trying to find Mrs. Kroll, and I couldn't find her. She must have been very young. She was a teacher at the school there. And so I don't know if she remarried or what happened, but I couldn't find her. But if he was troubled, he sure didn't say so in his report. All right, 10 pages worth. That's number one. But the most important thing she says is this. She says that Detective Kroll classified Natalie Wood's death as a homicide. Now, we just talked about what that means, right?
Yes.
That means death at the hands of another, okay? Not only is that not true, Detective Kroll actually writes in his report that this was an accidental drowning and uses a number classification for accidental drowning. Nowhere on this report anywhere does it say that it's a homicide. Nowhere. Okay. Where she came up with that, I don't know.
Wow.
The number classification, by the way, for homicide is 011. But the classification number that Kroll gave to this matter was 490. Person dead, apparent accidental drowning. It wasn't his job to say whether it was a homicide or not. It was his job to go out, interview people, prepare a report, and give it to his superiors, which is what he did. Now, as an aside, here is the most significant thing about Kroll's report. He has in there, and by the way, she also said that he quotes Wagner as saying that in response to the broken glass, that a bottle must have fallen on the floor. But those words are not in Kroll's report. Now, Kroll was dead when she wrote her book, so she certainly didn't get it from Kroll. So where she got that, I don't know either, but it's not in the report. But back to the most unusual thing about Deputy Kroll's report, and that is when he gets to the part where he's interviewing the people on the boat, there's no interview for Christopher Walken. None. It's got his name in there, but there's no interview of him, none whatsoever. Now, how Christopher Walken managed to slip off the yacht, slip into the sheriff's helicopter, and slide into the Long Beach Sheriff's Department, get interviewed for a couple of seconds, and run off to the Beverly Wilshire Hotel is beyond me. But
That's
he
wild.
did. It is wild. Something tells me that Deputy Kroll was a very conscientious deputy, and that Deputy Kroll would not have done something like that accidentally or intentionally. I think he was directed by his superiors not to mess with Christopher Walken for whatever reason, okay? I think that was the direction. I really believe that. And I had a lot of questions for Deputy Kroll, and I was sorely disappointed when I found out that he had passed away. Very prematurely, I might add. He was a young man. I think he would have been one heck of a witness about a whole bunch of things.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And you do a very thorough job of discussing his report in your book. It's a very, very interesting part of the book.
I have detailed resources in the back of my book. People need to look back there because I have additional narrative back there about different things that occurred. And specifically this about Deputy Kroll and this classification as a homicide. I lay it out in there. I put the details in there.
Tell us a little bit about, so the other book, which I had mentioned at the beginning of the interview, was the Marty Ruley, Dennis DeVerne book, Goodbye Natalie, Goodbye Splendor. Tell us a little bit about how that book fits into this case as a whole, your perspective on that book.
Once again now, Marty Ruley did not have any experience in criminal law or litigation or anything of that nature. So it's not surprising that she wouldn't understand the law of evidence. What she does in her book, and I don't criticize her for doing this, but there were things out there that she could have done that she didn't do if she would known a little bit more about investigations. But what she does in her book is, she and Davern had been trying to get his book published for almost 20 years. You know that?
Yes. Yes.
On the timeline? So that's a long time to try to get a book published, and I got to hand it to him for being persistent, okay?
That is a really long time.
Right.
Yeah.
But what she does in that book is, throughout the book, she has statements or quotes by him about what happened and who said what and that kind of thing. And then she tries to corroborate it. She tries to substantiate it to show that Dennis is telling the truth about it. But the difficulty is that she uses experiments and reenactments and polygraph examinations, all those things that are inadmissible in a courtroom. It's nice that somebody says Dennis Davern took a polygraph examination and passed. I mean, that's real nice. But everybody in America knows that polygraph examinations aren't admissible because they're unreliable. Some of the experiments and things that she did, I could understand somebody looking at them and thinking, that's very clever. I mean, I never thought of that. But if you don't duplicate the circumstances precisely, then again, it's not admissible in a courtroom. A perfect example is when she was trying to show that Natalie would have lost her socks if she was able to swim in the water by jumping in a cold swimming pool. On the surface, that looks pretty good, but it can't be done that way because you have to assume that the person that jumped in the swimming pool was afraid of water, like Natalie Wood. What I'm saying is we don't know that Natalie Wood would have been kicking her feet in the water. That's number one. Number two, it wasn't salt water. Salt water has a different effect on people, as you know, from swimming in the ocean than fresh water.
That's
so
a really
again, if you're not gonna jump into salt water, then you're not doing anything that's going to get you anywhere. And it was things like that. And if she would have worked with me, I would have explained that to her and told her that and said, we can do an updated book to your book, and we can do an investigation, a serious investigation. By that time, you see, she had a lot of contacts, and she told me that she had communication going on with the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. Well, that would have been helpful, if you were trying to write something. So when you ask me what contribution it makes, I think the only real contribution it makes is what Davern says transpired between the time that they left the restaurant and the time that people on the island were contacted about Natalie's disappearance, because those things can be corroborated, and I did corroborate them with scientific and forensic evidence and other evidence that I found in those crime scene photographs of the interior of the boat. From that standpoint, that's the contribution that book makes.
And I want to be clear that when you talk about Davern in your book, I believe that you are very clear that you back up the essence of what he's saying. You do question certain aspects of the methods with which he's told this story through the years, maybe, and the ways that he's contradicted himself at times. But I do feel like overall you back up the essence that you believe that he is essentially telling the truth. We probably haven't heard the whole story from him.
Well, first of all, I am absolutely confident we haven't heard the full story from Dennis Davern. And I don't know that we ever will. And if we do, I don't know that there's, 75% of the people that would believe it. Let me say this about him. I have prosecuted many cases where I had to put people of questionable credibility on the witness stand to testify against the defendant. Now, I knew when I did it, when I called them to the stand, that the defense was going to be able to eat them up a little bit. I mean, they were going to do some harm to them. But I put them on the stand because when it all boils down, the core essence of their testimony could be corroborated by other hard, unambiguous, serious evidence. And that's what I try to say in my book. Yes, over the years, and probably for money.
Not to give away our book.
We can't.
He said he knows she wouldn't step into the
We can't
thing.
tell them that. If we tell them that, then what is there? What do we have left? We don't have nothing.
But the core essence of his statements are very simply this. He said when they got back to the yacht that after a short while, Robert Wagner, who has now confessed to this, okay, got mad, took a wine bottle over his shoulder, and smashed it on a coffee table right in front of Natalie and walking with glass and wine flying all over the place. Okay? Then he says, Natalie, mad, as you might imagine, turned and stormed down to the master stateroom and slammed the door. Then he says that walking, after going out on the side of the boat for a while, came back in and he made a beeline to his stateroom. Then after that, after a short discussion, he says, Wagner said, I'm going to go down and talk to her, even though I don't think she'll talk to me. And when Wagner did, this explosive, screaming, yelling, banging fight took place. That ended up spilling out onto the back deck. And after a brief while out there, everything became silent. And when he went down, Wagner was standing on the back deck and Natalie was nowhere to be found. Now, that is the core essence of what happened that night to Natalie Wood from Dennis DeVern's standpoint. Whether he knew when she was in the water, whether he saw her being pushed, it really doesn't matter. What matters is that once she ends up in the water, what happens? Ordinarily, there is no duty, no legal duty for you to help anybody in distress. You know that? Yeah, if you're walking down the street and you see somebody in the pond and they're drowning, there's no legal duty for you to jump in. There's no legal duty for you to take a rope and throw it to them. There's no legal duty for you to do any of that stuff. All right? But if you have anything to do with them going into that pond and you don't help them, then you just murdered them.
Wow.
See what I mean?
I do.
There's a big difference between the two.
Mm-hmm.
So if you take the knowledge that they had of Natalie's fear of deep, dark water, the fact that she couldn't swim, she's now in that ocean, in the deep, dark water, which just breaks my heart to even talk about. And he looks down there and he sees her in the water and he lets her float away. He murdered her, just as if he took a gun and shot her right there. He murdered her because he had something to do with her going in the water. It doesn't matter if she was running from him and slipped and fell. If she was running from him, which, if Davern's telling the truth, about a big fight that spilled out on the back deck, and things like him saying, get off my fucking boat, if that's all true, then he had something to do with her going into the water. And if he did, then because he didn't do anything to fish her out of there, knowing full well she couldn't swim, he murdered her in 1981.
I think that you just laid that out with a distinction that's probably really helpful, for how people conceptualize this. Because to me, what you're saying there is that figuring out exactly everything that happened that night, we may never get there. It may just be unknowable at this point. But if we can prove that what you're saying is true, that even if we don't know the minutia of every detail, he was somehow responsible for how she ended up in there and failed to go in to help her, that's where we get our murder case from. And I think that's a really helpful thing for people in
That's
confession.
where it is. And technically, it's second-degree murder. It would be second-degree murder. And I explain why in my book, by the way. I give you the statutes. I show you the law. I give you the instructions that the judge gives to the juries. And so you can look at it and see exactly what you have to prove. And it would be a second-degree murder charge. So it's still viable. But you said something that I've got to make a comment about.
Sure.
You said that there are things that we will never know about. And that is exactly right. I can't tell you one murder case that I was ever involved in where even when the defendant told us what happened, it answered certain questions that people had about the evidence and what happened. There's always something in murder cases that never gets answered to people's satisfaction. Never.
Yeah. And, I do want to kind of reiterate for our viewers, these books have made their contributions. I think they do have their value. But I do think that when we're really reviewing all the empirical things that we know about this case, it is important to sift through and distill what we can prove and what we can't. And if there are things that were misrepresented or confused in other tellings, that does matter in trying to piece together the case. His book is in such a different league when it comes to the facts, when it comes to the research, when it comes to the understanding of the law, and just being able to give us a context for putting all these facts together. The depths that Sam goes to research, the stuff he pulls out, and the way that he uses his legal know-how, it is just so beyond what anybody else has ever done.
I appreciate you saying that. And I know you mean everything that you say. We're both coming from the same standpoint. We, both of us, do not want people to assume that what they've read that has been said over and over and over makes it the truth.
Absolutely.
I just wish that the case of People versus Robert Wagner Jr. would have made it to the courtroom.
Well, Sam, thank you so much for chatting with us again. I have really enjoyed this, as I did our first interview. I cannot wait to dig into the other aspects of this case and your book and your research and your investigation. I know that people are going to be fascinated. I hope our viewers have enjoyed this. I hope you have found it informative. We look forward to talking to you again. Have a great evening. Thank you. And thank you, Sam. Always great to see you.
Thank you, Carrie, for having me.
Absolutely. Anytime.